All right, let's go. Number 8. The Peking Man fossils. Between 1929 and 1937, in a series of limestone caves at Zhoukoudian, roughly 50 kilometers southwest of Beijing, a team of Chinese and Western paleontologists pulled from the earth one of the most significant collections of human ancestor remains ever assembled. The fossils belonged to Homo erectus pekinensis, a population of archaic humans who had walked the hills of northern China approximately 750,000 years ago. By the time excavation was suspended, the site had yielded skullcaps, teeth, jaw fragments, and postcranial bones representing roughly 40 individuals. Men, women, children. An entire community of early humans recovered from the cave floors where they had died. The scale of the discovery is difficult to overstate. Before Zhoukoudian, Homo erectus was known primarily from a single skullcap and a femur found in Java decades earlier. Peking man transformed a fragmentary species into a population. For the first time, anthropologists could study variation within an archaic human group, examine the wear patterns on dozens of teeth, measure the thickness of multiple skulls, and reconstruct the lives of beings who had used fire and stone tools 750,000 years before the first city was built. The fossils were the foundation on which an entire branch of human evolutionary science was constructed. The skullcaps themselves were extraordinary objects. Thick-walled, low-browed, heavy with mineralization, they had darkened to a deep brown over the hundreds of millennia they had spent buried in cave sediment. Each one was roughly the size of a small melon, dense and cold in the hand, the bone fossilized into something closer to stone than to anatomy. Photographs from the period show them lined up on laboratory tables in Beijing, catalogued, numbered, studied. They were the most carefully documented archaic human remains in the world. Then came 1941. By late autumn of that year, Japanese forces were advancing across northern China, and the staff of the Peking Union Medical College, where the fossils were stored, made the decision to evacuate the collection to the United States for safekeeping. The bones were carefully packed into 2 large wooden crates. The plan was straightforward. The crates would travel with a contingent of U.S. Marines being withdrawn from Beijing. They would board the SS President Harrison at the port of Qinhuangdao. They would cross the Pacific. They would be received at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where they would wait out the war. None of it happened. What happened next has never been reconstructed with certainty. The Marines were captured by Japanese forces in the days following the attack on Pearl Harbor. The SS President Harrison was run aground before it could reach its rendezvous. The crates containing the Peking man fossils, last documented on a train or possibly at a Marine barracks in Qinhuangdao in early December 1941, simply ceased to exist in the historical record. They were not found in Japanese custody. They were not found in any American facility. They were not found on the seabed, in any warehouse, in any private collection that could be verified. For 80 years, the fossils have been searched for, with an intensity bordering on obsession. Rewards have climbed into the millions of dollars. Leads have surfaced from former soldiers, from dock workers, from the heirs of wartime officers who claimed their fathers had stored mysterious crates in basements and attics. None of the leads have produced a single bone. Excavations have been conducted at suspected burial sites. Sonar surveys have been performed in harbors. Declassified intelligence files have been combed for any mention of the cargo. The fossils representing 40 human ancestors, the most complete record of Homo erectus ever assembled, vanished into the chaos of a single month in 1941 and have not been seen since. What remains is a shadow archive, plaster casts produced before the evacuation, black and white photographs, measurements recorded in notebooks, drawings made by anatomists who held the originals in their hands and never imagined they would be the last witnesses. Modern researchers studying Homo erectus still rely on those casts and those photographs, working from copies of copies, unable to apply any of the techniques that have transformed paleoanthropology in the last half-century. No DNA extraction. No high-resolution CT imaging. No isotope analysis. The bones that could answer those questions are gone. The truly unsettling aspect is what the loss represents. The Peking Man collection was not lost in the deep past. It was not buried by an ice sheet or drowned by a rising sea. It was packed into 2 crates by careful hands, loaded onto a train under armed guard, and erased within weeks. The most important archaic human fossils ever discovered slipped out of human custody during a window of a few days and have never returned. If a collection of that magnitude, documented by that many witnesses, protected by that much institutional weight, could disappear so completely, the question is no longer whether prehistoric evidence can vanish. The question is, how much of it already has? Number 7. The Saqqara bird. In 1898, during excavations at a tomb in Saqqara, Egypt, archaeologists pulled a small wooden object from the burial assemblage and cataloged it without ceremony. It was a bird figurine. Light tan sycamore wood, smooth, weighing just 39 grams, with a wingspan of approximately 18 centimeters. It was filed away in a Cairo collection and forgotten for nearly 3/4 of a century. The tomb itself dated to approximately 200 BCE, though some researchers have argued for earlier origins based on stylistic comparison with older funerary deposits. Nothing about the initial classification suggested anything remarkable. Ancient Egyptians produced bird imagery constantly: falcons for Horus, ibises for Thoth, vultures for Nekhbet. A small wooden bird in a tomb was the most ordinary thing the dig could have surrendered. The object was assigned a catalog number and placed into storage at what would become the Museum of Egyptian Antiquities in Cairo. There it sat, unremarkable, for 71 years. Then someone looked again. In 1969, Egyptian physician and amateur archaeologist Khalil Messiha noticed something the original catalogers had missed. The proportions were wrong. Egyptian bird figurines, of which thousands exist across collections worldwide, almost universally feature articulated legs, detailed feathering, and horizontal tail feathers spread in the manner of an actual bird. The Saqqara object had none of these. It had no legs at all. Its wings were not the curved, splayed wings of a depicted creature in flight. They were straight, slightly downturned, and set at an angle that any modern aeronautical engineer would recognize immediately. And rising from the back of the body was something that should not have existed on a representation of a bird: a vertical tail fin. Birds do not have vertical tail fins. Aircraft do. The implications, once stated, were difficult to retract. The Saqqara object did not resemble a bird in any anatomically meaningful sense. It resembled a glider. The straight wings carried a slight dihedral, the upward angle that gives modern aircraft lateral stability in flight. The body was streamlined in a way that served no symbolic function, and the vertical stabilizer at the rear corresponded to no feature found in Egyptian iconography of birds, no feature found in birds themselves, and no feature found in any decorative tradition of the ancient Mediterranean. It corresponded only to the engineering requirements of controlled flight through air. In the years that followed, several aeronautical researchers examined photographs and replicas of the artifact and reported that the proportions were consistent with a functional glider design. Some claimed that scaled-up models, when launched, produced stable flight. Others disputed these findings, arguing that the object was symbolic, votive, or simply an unusual stylistic choice by a single craftsman working 2,000 years ago. But here's where the mystery deepens into something genuinely unsettling. To resolve the debate, researchers needed access to the complete artifact. Specifically, they needed the tailpiece, the small horizontal element that, if present and properly proportioned, would confirm or rule out aerodynamic intent. A horizontal stabilizer, in addition to the vertical fin, would push the object firmly into the territory of deliberate flight engineering. Its absence would suggest decorative coincidence. The tailpiece, according to multiple reports, has gone missing. At some point during the decades the Saqqara bird has spent in Cairo's collection, a fragment of it disappeared. Accounts vary as to when. Accounts vary as to how. What does not vary is the practical consequence. The single test that could resolve whether ancient Egyptians had stumbled onto, modeled, or fully understood the principles of fixed-wing flight cannot now be conducted. The geometry that mattered most is no longer available for measurement. What remains is a 39-gram piece of sycamore wood sitting in a museum in Cairo, photographed thousands of times, replicated in plastic and balsa by hobbyists and engineers, debated in conferences and dismissed in textbooks. It is officially still there. It is officially still cataloged. But the question it was capable of answering has been quietly amputated by the disappearance of a piece small enough to fit in a closed hand. This is the pattern that begins to emerge across the prehistoric record. The objects survive. The most important parts of the objects do not. A skull cap is preserved. The casts that could be retested vanish. A wooden bird sits in its case. The tail that would have ended the argument is gone. Each loss is small. Each loss is plausible. Each loss removes precisely the evidence required to settle the question the artifact raises. The Saqqara bird still rests in Cairo, light enough to balance on a fingertip, old enough to have watched the Ptolemies rise and fall, shaped in a way no other bird carving from the ancient world has ever been shaped. Whether its makers understood what they were modeling, no one can now say. The piece that would have told us is missing. Number 6. The Acámbaro figurines. In 1944, a German hardware merchant named Waldemar Hulsrud was riding his horse along the lower slopes of Cerro del Toro, near the town of Acámbaro in the Mexican state of Guanajuato, when he noticed something protruding from the eroded earth. He dismounted and pulled it free. It was a small ceramic figurine, reddish-brown, unmistakably handworked. He hired a local farmer named Odilon Tinajero to dig for more, paying 1 peso for every intact piece brought to his door. Over the following decades, Tinajero and his workers would unearth more than 33,000 of them. The scale alone defies easy explanation. This was not a handful of curiosities. This was an industrial volume of artifacts, a buried inventory large enough to fill rooms, then more rooms, then an entire private museum in Julsrud's house in central Acámbaro. The figurines were small, mostly between 10 and 30 centimeters tall, fired from local clay, the same reddish-brown earthenware that characterizes pre-Columbian ceramic traditions across central Mexico. Some were crude, others were exquisite. Many featured intricate scale-like textures pressed into the clay with a precision that suggested skilled hands working from observation rather than imagination. And that was where the problem began. Because among the human figures, the dogs, the household objects, and the recognizable fauna of the region, there were creatures that should not have been there. Long-necked sauropods, theropod silhouettes with serrated dorsal ridges, squat, armored quadrupeds that resembled nothing in the Mexican fossil record available to a rural farmer in the 1940s. Some figurines depicted humans riding these creatures. Others showed them in domestic poses, coiled beside seated figures, lounging at the feet of what appeared to be children. The implication, taken at face value, was impossible. Either an ancient culture in central Mexico had access to anatomical knowledge of dinosaurs that science said no human being could possibly have possessed, or the entire collection was an elaborate fraud manufactured on a scale that itself defied belief. The numbers refused to cooperate with either explanation. In 1968, samples were submitted to the laboratories of the University of Pennsylvania for thermoluminescence dating. The initial results returned ages around 4,500 years. Later retesting, performed after researchers learned of the dinosaur imagery, produced wildly different readings, some suggesting the pieces were modern. Carbon dating attempts on associated organic material yielded a similar chaos of contradictions. Ages ranged from approximately 4,000 years old to essentially yesterday. No two laboratories agreed. No coherent timeline emerged. The figurines existed in a kind of temporal limbo, refusing to commit to any era a researcher tried to assign them. Excavations conducted by Charles Hapgood and others in the 1950s reportedly found figurines beneath undisturbed colonial-era structures and beneath stratigraphic layers that would have required deliberate, decades-long forgery to fake. Skeptical archaeologists countered that Tinahero and his workers had every financial incentive to produce as many figurines as Julsrud was willing to buy, and that the rural pottery traditions of Guanajuato were more than capable of mass production at the required scale. The debate calcified. The mainstream archaeological community classified the entire collection as a hoax and moved on. A small fringe of researchers continued to insist that the volume, the stratigraphy, and the inconsistencies in the dating made the simple fraud explanation untenable. But here's where the story becomes genuinely impossible to resolve. Sometime during the latter decades of the 20th century, hundreds of the most controversial figurines, the dinosaur depictions, the riders, the anatomically specific pieces that had drawn the most scrutiny, began disappearing from storage. Some vanished from Julsrud's own collection after his death in 1964. Others disappeared during transfers between private holdings and the small municipal museum that eventually inherited a portion of the find. No comprehensive inventory had ever been completed. No comprehensive scientific analysis had ever been performed. The pieces that would have allowed modern testing, advanced thermoluminescence, micro-CT scanning, residue analysis on the clay surfaces, were precisely the pieces that went missing first. What remains in the Museo Valdemar Julsrud today is a fraction of the original collection. The dinosaur figurines that survive are largely the more ambiguous specimens, the ones whose forms could be argued as stylized lizards, mythological creatures, or coincidental resemblances. The most damning pieces, the ones that would have either confirmed an extraordinary hoax or shattered the established timeline of human prehistory, are simply gone. Taken, sold, misplaced, buried again in private collections that will never surface. What makes the Acámbaro figurines particularly haunting is not the question of whether they are authentic. It is the question of what the disappearance itself means. If the collection was a hoax, the missing pieces were the evidence that would have proved it definitively. If the collection was something else, something the archaeological community was not prepared to accept, the missing pieces were the evidence that would have forced the conversation. Either way, the figurines that vanished took the answer with them. 33,000 artifacts emerged from the soil of central Mexico. The ones that mattered most are no longer anywhere a scientist can reach them. Number 5. The Mitchell Hedges Crystal Skull, the artifact that may never have been ancient at all. In 1924, on an expedition into the dense lowland jungle of British Honduras, the territory now known as Belize, the British adventurer F.A. Mitchell Hedges was excavating the ruins of Luban Tun, a Maya city abandoned more than 1,000 years earlier. According to the account that would later define the artifact's mythology, his adopted daughter Anna, 17 years old at the time, climbed into a collapsed temple and emerged holding a human skull carved from a single block of clear quartz. The detached jaw, she would claim, was found 3 months later in the same ruins. The skull weighed 5.13 kilograms. It was anatomically accurate to a degree that unsettled the men who handled it. And it was, by Mitchell Hedges' own description, the most extraordinary object he had ever encountered in a career built on encountering extraordinary objects. The skull's physical presence is difficult to convey in language. It is glassy, almost wet-looking, translucent enough that light passes through the cranium and concentrates in the eye sockets in ways that have unnerved every photographer who has tried to document it. Visitors who have held it consistently report the same sensation. It is cold, not cool, not room temperature. Cold in a way that does not match the warmth of the room around it. The cheekbones are correctly proportioned. The cranial sutures are subtly suggested. The mandible, when fitted to the skull, articulates with a precision that suggests the carver understood the mechanics of the human jaw at a level that pre-Columbian Maya artisans were not believed to possess. Mitchell Hedges claimed the skull was at least 3,600 years old, a sacred object of Maya priests used to will death upon enemies. The claim was theatrical. It was also, for decades, unfalsifiable. Quartz cannot be carbon dated. It contains no organic material. It does not accumulate the kind of weathering signatures that geologists use to age stone surfaces. An object carved from a single block of clear crystal exists outside the normal toolkit of archaeological dating. It is, in a very literal sense, a stone that refuses to tell its age. Then, in the 1970s, the skull entered the laboratories of Hewlett-Packard in Santa Clara, California. The company's crystal specialists were among the best in the world, accustomed to analyzing quartz for industrial and electronic applications. They examined the skull under high magnification, in polarized light, across the grain of the crystal lattice. What they found, or rather what they failed to find, became the foundation of every serious doubt that has trailed the artifact ever since. There were no microscopic scratches, no tool marks, no telltale striations of the kind that ancient hand carving inevitably leaves on a stone surface, even one as hard as quartz. The skull appeared to have been worked with rotary tools, possibly with abrasives like diamond paste, in a manner consistent with industrial techniques that did not exist in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. The implication was devastating to the artifact's mythology. If the skull bore no evidence of ancient hand carving, it was not ancient. It was a modern fabrication, possibly 19th century, possibly later, dressed in a story of jungle discovery by a man whose career had been built on stories. But here's where the question becomes genuinely impossible to close. The Mitchell Hedges skull is not the only one of its kind. Over the course of the 20th century, at least a dozen so-called ancient crystal skulls surfaced in private collections, museum holdings, and the vaults of dealers across Europe and the Americas. The British Museum acquired one. The Smithsonian acquired one. The Musée du Quai Branly in Paris acquired one. Each was presented as pre-Columbian. Each was, eventually, subjected to scrutiny that suggested otherwise. And then, quietly, several of the most contested specimens began to disappear. Skulls vanished from private collections during estate transfers. Skulls disappeared from museum storage between catalog updates. Skulls that had been promised for testing never arrived at the laboratories expecting them. The pattern was not dramatic. It was administrative. An object listed in one inventory and absent from the next. A loan agreement that was never honored. A collector who died, and whose holdings, when examined, no longer contained the piece that had been photographed in his sitting room a decade earlier. What makes the Mitchell Hedges skull particularly unsettling is not the question of whether it is ancient or modern. It is the recognition that the question may never be answerable because the comparative evidence has been systematically thinned. To determine whether a single crystal skull is genuine, you need other crystal skulls. You need a corpus. You need specimens of varying provenance to establish baselines for tool marks, mineral inclusions, and carving techniques. That corpus, never large to begin with, has been quietly hollowed out over the last 50 years. The skulls that remain accessible are the ones whose modern origins are most obvious. The skulls that vanished were, in many cases, the ones whose authenticity was most fiercely contested. The Mitchell Hedges skull itself remains in private hands, passed through Anna's estate after her death in 2007. It has not been made available for the kind of comprehensive modern analysis that might finally resolve its origin. It sits, cold to the touch, refracting light through its eye sockets, in a location its current custodians have declined to disclose. Whatever it is, whoever made it, whenever they made it, the answer is locked inside a stone that cannot be dated, and a chain of comparable evidence that has been steadily, quietly erased. Number 4. The Baigong Pipes. In 1996, a small expedition of Chinese writers and researchers traveling through the arid badlands of Qinghai province in northwestern China climbed the slopes of Mount Baigong and walked into a cave that should not have contained what they found inside it. The mountain stands alone in a salt-crusted basin, a pyramid-shaped peak rising from one of the most desolate landscapes in Central Asia. 3 triangular openings pierce its base. 2 have collapsed. The third is still passable. The researchers entered the surviving cave, expecting nothing more than weathered stone. What they saw embedded in the cave walls was metal. Dozens of hollow pipes, rust-red and clearly tubular, ran through the rock as if the mountain had grown around them. Some were no thicker than a toothpick. Others measured nearly 40 centimeters across. They ran in a roughly triangular pattern, intersecting the cave walls at angles that suggested deliberate placement rather than geological accident. More pipes extended outward from the cave mouth, descending across the basin floor, vanishing into the bed of a saltwater lake just beyond the mountain's base. Pipes in the rock, pipes in the soil, pipes under the water. A network of corroded metal threading through a landscape that had never seen a human settlement. The Beijing Institute of Geology eventually sent technicians to take samples. The results, released through Chinese state media in 2002, were the kind of numbers that geologists tend to read twice. The iron content of the pipes matched smelted metal. Approximately 8% of the material's composition could not be identified at all, and the surrounding rock, which the pipes were fused into rather than merely buried within, dated to roughly 150,000 years before the present. The implication was unspeakable. The earliest unambiguous evidence of human iron smelting appears in the archaeological record around 3000 BCE. The Baigong pipes, if the dating held, predated that achievement by approximately 148,000 years. They predated agriculture. They predated cities. They predated the emergence of behaviorally modern humans across most of the planet. Whoever or whatever produced these pipes was working with smelted metal at a time when our ancestors were chipping flint by firelight. The conventional explanations arrived quickly, as they always do. Some geologists proposed that the pipes were fossilized tree roots, mineralized by iron-rich groundwater seeping through ancient sediment over geological time. Others suggested they were the casts of vanished organic material, hollow tubes left behind when buried plant tissue rotted away and was replaced by precipitated minerals. These hypotheses are reasonable. They explain certain features. They do not explain the metallurgical signature. They do not explain the unidentified 8%. They do not explain why fossilized roots would form a triangular pattern at the entrance of a cave whose other 2 openings had collapsed inward. But here's where the story becomes genuinely impossible to resolve. In the early 2000s, after the initial samples had been sent to laboratories in Beijing and Lanzhou for further analysis, the key pipes, the specimens that had produced the most anomalous readings, the fragments that contained the unidentified material, disappeared. Not all of them, just the ones that mattered. Subsequent researchers attempting to verify the original findings discovered that the chain of custody had broken somewhere between the field site and the laboratory shelves. The samples that remained were the less diagnostic ones. The pipes that could have settled the question were no longer in any catalog that outside investigators could access. And then access to Mount Baigong itself was restricted. The site, once visited by journalists and curious travelers, was placed under increasing administrative control. Independent geological teams attempting to collect new samples found their permits delayed, denied, or quietly rescinded. The mountain that had briefly hosted international attention in 2002 became, by the end of the decade, effectively closed to the outside scientific community. What remained available to researchers was the published Chinese summary, a handful of low-resolution photographs, and the memory of measurements that no one could independently confirm. What makes the Baigong case particularly disturbing is not the possibility that ancient metallurgists worked iron 150,000 years ago in a saltwater basin in Central Asia. That possibility is staggering, but it is a possibility that science could, in principle, address. What is disturbing is that the addressing has been made impossible. The pipes are still in the rock. The lake still hides whatever lies beneath it. The mountain still stands in the basin. But the samples that would resolve the question are gone, and the site that produced them is no longer accessible to the people who would ask the next question. Several Chinese geologists have continued to defend the natural formation hypothesis. Several others have quietly noted that natural formation does not typically produce hollow metallic tubes with measurable iron percentages and a triangular distribution at a cave mouth. The debate cannot advance. The evidence required to advance it has been removed from the conversation. And so the Baigong pipes occupy a peculiar position in the literature. They are not officially anomalous, because the anomalous samples no longer exist to be tested. They are not officially mundane, because the dating that produced the original alarm has never been formally retracted. They sit in the rock face of a closed mountain in a closed basin in a province most outside researchers will never visit, rust-red and silent, threading through stone that is older than our species. Somewhere in a laboratory catalog in Beijing or Lanzhou, there is an empty slot where a piece of metal used to be. What that metal was, who made it, and why 8% of its composition matched nothing on Earth, is a question that the Disappearance has answered with silence. Number 3. The Koso artifact, the object that should have settled the question, and instead disappeared, with the question still open. In February 1961, 3 rock hunters named Wallace Lane, Virginia Maxey, and Mike Meixel were searching for unusual geodes in the hills above Olancha, California, on the western edge of the Mojave Desert. They were prospecting for material to sell in their gem shop, scanning the dry slopes for the nodules that weather out of the volcanic rock in that region. By the end of the day, they had collected enough to fill their bags. One of those nodules, picked up somewhere on the flank of the Koso Mountains, would become one of the most argued over objects in 20th century anomalous archaeology. The next morning, Meixel put it on his diamond saw to cut it open, expecting crystal. The blade was destroyed almost immediately. Whatever was inside the nodule was not quartz. What they finally extracted, after grinding the stone away from the object embedded within it, looked nothing like a mineral specimen. It looked like a spark plug. A ceramic core ran down the center of the object. Around that core sat a copper sleeve, corroded but unmistakable. Through the ceramic ran a metallic shaft, and roughly 4 centimeters of metal protruded from one end. Surrounding the entire assembly was a hexagonal sleeve of what appeared to be fossilized wood, now turned to stone, gray-white in color and stained with rust, where iron in the shaft had bled into the surrounding matrix over time. The object had been sealed inside the nodule completely. No crack, no entry point, no obvious way for a modern manufactured component to have arrived at the center of a stone pulled from a California hillside. The nodule itself was the problem. Geologists who examined the outer matrix found it studded with fossil shells, marine remnants from a period when that part of California had been submerged. The estimated age of the encasing material was at least 500,000 years. By every conventional geological standard, whatever was inside the nodule had been there for 500,000 years. That timeline is impossible. 500,000 years ago, Homo sapiens did not exist. The hominins alive at that point were chipping flint into hand axes. Nothing on Earth was casting ceramic, drawing copper into sleeves, or assembling threaded metal shafts. The Koso artifact, taken at face value, demanded a rewriting of the human story so complete that no existing framework could accommodate it. But here is where the conventional explanation cuts back the other way, and cuts hard. In 1999, researchers from the Pierre Stromberg-led skeptical inquiry compared photographs and measurements of the Koso artifact to champion spark plugs manufactured in the United States in the 1920s. The match was close. The dimensions, the ceramic insulator, the configuration of the copper sleeve, the threaded shaft, all of it lined up with a particular model of champion plug from that era. The argument they offered was geological rather than archaeological. Concretions, they pointed out, do not always take 500,000 years to form. Iron objects discarded in alkaline desert. Soils can accumulate a nodule of mineralized material around them in decades, sometimes in years. A spark plug dropped from a Model T crossing the Mojave in the 1920s, lost in a wash, slowly cemented into a crust of caliche and iron oxide and embedded shells from the surrounding sediment, could plausibly look, by 1961, like a 500,000-year-old anomaly. That explanation is reasonable. It is also unproven, because the Koso artifact was never subjected to the kind of testing that would have ended the argument in either direction. No high-resolution computed tomography. No spectroscopic analysis of the ceramic. No isotopic dating of the copper. No mineralogical study of the nodule's growth layers to determine whether the encasing material formed over decades or over geological time. The technologies that could have answered the question definitively all matured after the artifact left the hands of anyone who would have permitted such testing. Sometime in the 1990s, the Koso artifact disappeared. It had passed through private collectors, changed hands quietly, surfaced in photographs, then stopped surfacing. There was no theft report that became public, no museum announcement, no formal cataloging of where the object had last been seen. It simply ceased to appear. The X-ray images taken in 1961, grainy and inconclusive, became the only record of what had been inside the stone. The photographs of the exterior, the descriptions of the hexagonal fossilized sleeve, the measurements of the exposed shaft, these are now the entire physical archive. The Koso artifact may have been a champion spark plug. It may have been something the conventional timeline of human history cannot account for. The honest answer is that no one alive can prove either case. The object that could have settled one of the most contested anomalies in 20th century archaeology vanished into private hands before the tools to interrogate it existed. The question is still on the table. The answer left the room. Number 2. The Klerksdorp spheres. The objects that shouldn't exist in rocks older than complex life. In the pyrophyllite mines near Ottosdal, South Africa, workers have been pulling something out of the rock for decades that no geologist has ever fully explained. The mines extract a soft metamorphic mineral used in ceramics and refractory applications, quarried from deposits in the Transvaal supergroup that have been dated by multiple independent methods to approximately 2.8 billion years old. To put that number in context, 2.8 billion years ago, the Earth's atmosphere contained almost no free oxygen. The Great Oxygenation Event was still hundreds of millions of years in the future. Complex multicellular life would not appear for another 2 billion years. There were no animals. There were no plants. There were no fungi. There was bacteria, single-celled organisms, suspended in a sea under a sky that would have been unbreathable to anything living today. That is the world in which these rocks formed, and embedded within them, hundreds of small metallic-looking spheres. The objects range from 30 to 50 millimeters in diameter, roughly the size of a golf ball or smaller. Their coloring varies from a dull bluish metallic sheen to a deeper reddish hue, depending on the specimen and the mineralogical conditions of its formation. What sets them apart from ordinary geological concretions is a feature that has unsettled observers for over a century. Most of the spheres carry 3 parallel grooves running around their equators, not one groove, not random scoring. 3. Evenly spaced, encircling the object at its widest point with a precision that suggests intent rather than accident. When cracked open, the interiors reveal a fibrous, almost wood-like structure radiating outward from a central point. When struck against a hard surface, certain specimens produce a clear ringing tone that has been described by researchers and mine workers alike as eerie, sustained, resonant, in a way that ordinary stone is not. The official explanation is that the spheres are natural concretions, mineral aggregates that formed in the surrounding pyrophyllite through processes involving the precipitation of hematite, wollastonite, and goethite over geological timescales. Geologists have published papers arguing that the parallel grooves correspond to bedding planes in the host rock, and that the spherical shape results from radial crystal growth around a nucleus. The argument is not unreasonable. Concretions are real geological phenomena. They form in sedimentary rocks across the planet. They can be remarkably round. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart for the most perfectly formed specimens. Concretions in the geological record tend toward approximate sphericity. They are lumpy, irregular, often elongated along the axis of bedding. The Klerksdorp spheres that drew the most attention, the ones photographed for textbooks and displayed in museum cases, were not approximately spherical. They were geometrically precise. The parallel grooves on the finest examples ran with a regularity that observers compared to machined work. Several specimens reportedly held to such tight tolerances that they could be balanced on a flat surface and rotated without wobble. In a rock formed nearly 3 billion years ago, in an era when the most advanced life on Earth was a mat of cyanobacteria, something produced objects that look engineered. The question of whether they are engineered or merely the strangest concretions on the planet has never been resolved, and it may never be resolved, because the specimens that mattered most are gone. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the Klerksdorp Museum in South Africa housed the most significant collection of these spheres, including the examples whose geometric perfection had drawn the attention of researchers, journalists, and visiting geologists from multiple countries. During this period, the museum was struck by a series of break-ins. The targets were specific. The thieves did not take administrative records. They did not take the larger mineral displays. They took the spheres. Not all of them. Only the most perfectly formed specimens. The ones with the cleanest grooves, the tightest geometry, the most disturbing implications. What remains in the museum's collection today are the lesser examples, spheres that are recognizably spherical, but less perfectly so. Grooves that are present, but less precise. The specimens that supported the standard concretion explanation comfortably. The specimens that challenged it have vanished into private hands, or into oblivion, and modern testing methods that did not exist in the 1980s, scanning electron microscopy at resolutions capable of distinguishing growth banding from machining marks, isotopic analysis capable of identifying any anomalous inclusions, cannot be applied to objects that no longer exist in any accessible collection. What makes the loss particularly disturbing is the timing. The break-ins occurred precisely during the decades when public interest in the spheres was peaking, when researchers were beginning to ask questions that required access to the original specimens. The pattern of theft was selective in a way that random vandalism is not. Someone wanted those specific objects removed from the scientific record. Whatever the Klerksdorp spheres are, natural concretions of unusual perfection, or something the standard model of Earth's history cannot accommodate, the answer is encoded in objects that geology produced 2.8 billion years ago, and that human hands removed from study within the span of a single decade. The lesser specimens still sit in their museum drawers, less perfect, less troubling, less able to force the question that the missing ones embodied. The rocks that held them have not changed. The planet that formed them has not changed. Only the evidence has been thinned, quietly, deliberately, until what remains can be explained without difficulty, and what cannot be explained is gone. Number 1. the Dropa stones. In 1938, an archaeologist named Chipute led an expedition into the Baigong Mountains, a remote range straddling the border between China and Tibet, where the air thins and the valleys narrow into corridors of stone. Inside a network of caves carved into the rock, his team reportedly found a series of graves. The bodies inside were small, fragile, with disproportionately large skulls, and alongside them, stacked carefully or arranged in deliberate patterns depending on which version of the account one believes, were the stones. 716 of them. Granite-like, gray, each disc roughly 30 centimeters in diameter, each perforated by a single round hole at its center. From that central hole, a spiraling groove ran outward to the edge, etched so finely that the surface resembled nothing so much as the playing surface of a phonograph record. Within those, spirals, magnified under whatever instruments the period afforded, were tiny hieroglyphic-like symbols. Not Chinese, not Tibetan, not any script cataloged in any linguistic database. The discs were said to be 12,000 years old. That alone would have made them one of the most significant prehistoric finds in Asian archaeology. Discs of inscribed stone predating Sumerian cuneiform by 7,000 years. Predating the construction of Göbekli Tepe by 2,000. A writing system older than writing itself. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. In the decades following the alleged discovery, a translation began to circulate. The symbols, when decoded, were said to tell the story of a crash. Beings from elsewhere, the account claimed, had descended into the Baigong Mountains in some kind of craft, become stranded, and attempted to integrate with the local population. The small bodies in the graves, the disproportionate skulls, the inscribed discs that resembled recording media, all of it allegedly formed a single coherent narrative engraved into stone 12 millennia ago. The translation was attributed to a researcher named Tsum Nui, working in Beijing, who reportedly faced professional ruin after publishing it and emigrated to Japan, where he died not long after. The implications, if any of it were true, would dismantle the foundations of recorded prehistory. A documented contact event, physical remains, a writing system inscribed in a medium that resembled audio recording technology. 716 identical discs, each one a copy of the same impossible message, distributed across a graveyard at the edge of the Tibetan plateau. Researchers requested access. Photographs were demanded. Independent linguists asked to examine the symbols, and one by one, the responses from Beijing grew quieter, more evasive, more contradictory. Then the discs vanished. Sometime in the 1990s, the original stones reportedly disappeared from the Banpo Museum in Beijing, the institution that had allegedly housed them for decades. There was no announcement, no inventory record of transfer, no photographs of the discs being crated or moved. They simply ceased to be available for examination. When Western researchers inquired in the years that followed, the responses grew more disturbing still. The former director of the Banpo Museum, when pressed, allegedly denied that the discs had ever existed at all. Not stolen, not lost, not transferred to another institution. Never there, never real. What remains is a handful of blurry photographs, taken decades apart by different hands, of dark gray discs with central holes and spiraling grooves. The images are low resolution. The angles are inconsistent. The symbols within the spirals are visible only as suggestions, faint marks that could be deliberate engraving, or could be the artifacts of poor film stock. The translations that circulate are disputed by every linguist who has examined them. The provenance is contested at every link in the chain. Chipute's original expedition records, if they ever existed in complete form, have not been located. Tsum Nui's published translation, if it was ever formally published, exists only in secondary references, citing other secondary references in a recursive loop with no verifiable origin. The Dropa stones may be the most elaborate hoax in the history of fringe archaeology. Or They may be the most successfully suppressed discovery of the 20th century. There is no way, now, to know. The objects that would settle the question are gone. The institution that allegedly held them denies the holding. The man who allegedly found them is dead. The man who allegedly translated them is dead. The graves they were allegedly recovered from, if they were ever excavated, have not been re-entered by any documented expedition. What makes the Dropa stones the most disturbing entry on this list is not the content of the alleged translation. It is the structure of the disappearance itself. An entire archaeological discovery, 716 physical objects, a translated narrative, a decade of institutional housing, has been compressed into a void. The stones are not lost in the way the Peking man fossils are lost, with a documented chain of custody that ends in wartime chaos. They are lost in a more complete sense. They are lost from the record of having existed. And this is where the pattern of every prehistoric find on this list reaches its terminal expression. The Peking man fossils vanished. The Saqqara bird lost its tail. The Acámbaro figurines disappeared from storage. The Koso artifact changed hands until it was gone. The Klerksdorp spheres were stolen in the dark. Each disappearance left behind enough residue to confirm that something had once been present. The Dropa stones leave only the residue of a denial. 716 discs of inscribed gray stone, 12,000 years old, recording a message no one was ever permitted to verify. They are not in any museum. They are not in any catalog. They may never have been anywhere at all. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.